even leave the meeting. This is just as an information. And before I'll introduce you to the webinar series, I would like to give the word to Christian to briefly tell you a little bit about the geography of innovation.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Jonathan. It's actually just a very short intro about the GOST sort of thematic group in the Sustainability Transitions Research Network. So since about 5 years, we run a thematic group in that network, which is focusing on the geography of sustainability transitions. And with that group, basically what we want to achieve is really sort of create an open forum for scholarly exchanges about, sustainability transitions and the how and where and why they come about. And so, basically this is a network of about 700 interested scholars. We're not exactly sure how many there are now, but based on the sort of feedback we get from the webinar series and so on, that's about the community. We're sort of coordinating a bit. And so what we do is basically really creating this forum in different ways. So one thing are the webinar series, like the one which you joined just now. We also sort of often, organize conference tracks at the IST conference, but also at geography conferences like AAG, GCG, and so on. We have a website and a LinkedIn profile where we also exchange sort of news about papers, jobs, and so on. And every now and then we write an agenda paper or organize a special issue in this broad thematic field of the geography of transitions. And we also run actually a working paper series. I want to also mention that very quickly. So if you have some pre-published work or work that doesn't fit into a journal, but you still want to get it out, then this is a nice place to also submit. And so basically it's just also from my side, just an invitation. This is an open forum in a way. So if you have ideas, if you want to be active in this sort of group, then just be in touch with us at any time and then really help us sort of propel this open forum forward. So that was just a very short teaser about what we're doing in this group and really hope to see many people get active in the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Christian, for this very brief introduction. So then it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's webinar or to the overall webinar series in general. So we thought about having a webinar series in which basically scholars from the global production network communities and the global value chains communities can interrogate and interact with the GOST. So we try to basically have several intentions with this webinar series. So the idea is that we can, on the one hand side, explore and create a space in which these communities can basically cross-fertilize, so that we can exchange and advance our understanding of sustainability transition processes and outcomes across space and scale. So with a point that lies, of course, at the heart of the GOST community. Then, of course, we also hope that we can basically generate conceptual inspiration from this conversation for both communities, like on the one hand side, the GOST community, but of course also the GPN and GBC scholars in how sustainability transition frameworks can actually inform their research. And then, of course, as a third step, we also are interested in developing a broader research agenda at the interface of sustainability transitions and GPN, GBC debates. And this webinar series is one part of a broader kind of like agenda in which also the special issue that is currently advertised at IST belongs to. And then we will also continue our discussions at this year's IST in Zurich. If you're interested, you can submit papers to the GOST track, and we will then basically create a session on the intersection between transitions and GBCs and GPNs. So before I introduce you to the speakers of today and today's topic, I would like to remind you that there's 3 other webinars coming up. So one about incumbents, power and governance in value chains. Then there's one about developmental outcomes and just transitions. And then finally, we will have a webinar on the topic of how we can use GVC and GPN lenses to understand geopolitical disruptions and the current challenges in sustainability transitions. Today, we have the intention to basically set the scene for these upcoming webinars, and we have invited, and we are very pleased that we have quite leading scholars here, both from the transitions community that have been working at the intersection of sustainability transitions and GPCs and GPNs. And it's my pleasure to basically introduce those four. I'll start with Neil, he's a professor of economic geography and head of the School of Geosciences at the University of Sydney. His research interests are in the areas of global production networks, regional economic development, and labor geography. He is currently focusing a lot on critical mineral global production networks and regional development in Australia. And he has authored Advanced Introduction to Global Production Networks and co-edited Labor Regimes and Global Production. Then it's also my pleasure to introduce Lea Fünfschilling, who's an associate professor at the Department of Sociology, as well as member of Circle at Lund University. She holds a PhD from the University of Basel in Switzerland and is interdisciplinary interested in research interests that are located at the intersection of sociology and science and technology studies. She has particularly contributed to a distinctly institutional perspective on sustainability transition and has recently been awarded an ERC starting grant called Endings towards the theory of endings in innovation studies. I'm also very happy that Roberta Rabelotti is joining us today. She is a professor of economics at the University of Pavia and a visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg. She has a PhD from the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, and her research interests concern innovation, economic development, and regional economics, with a particular attention to industrial clusters, global value chains, multinational enterprises, innovation systems, and the green transition. She also has advised quite a lot of international organizations, including the European Commission, OECD, UN, EDO, and other and Asian Development Bank, to name a few. Then finally, Christian Binz is a research group leader at the Department of Environmental Social Sciences at EWAC and an associate researcher at Circle Lund University, as well as a guest lecturer at the University of Zurich. His research focuses on the geographies of transformative innovation in the water, energy, mobility, and construction sectors, and he combines recent insights from transition studies, economic geography, and institutional sociology to explore the multi-scalar institutional arrangements and innovation dynamics that condition the emergence of new clean tech industries. He has widely published in key journals of innovation and transition studies, and he's also leading the STRN thematic group on the geography of sustainability transitions. So in the following now, we will hear brief inputs from all of the four speakers before we move to a moderated discussion that will then also be open to your questions and comments after some time. Yes, so we'll start with Neil. It's my pleasure to have you, and feel free to let us know about your perspective on this.
Okay, thanks for having me, and good evening from Sydney. 5 minutes is not long, so I'm going to plunge right in. Predictably, perhaps, I want to argue that GPN and cognate frameworks have a lot to offer the wider research agenda on sustainability transitions. Given time constraints, I'm going to assume a certain level of knowledge about the GPN approach. Suffice to say that it's a 20-plus-year-old body of work emerging from economic geography that seeks to understand the organizational architecture of the global economy and its effects on local and regional development processes. My connection to sustainability transitions comes from ongoing work on critical mineral GPNs in Australia with my collaborator Leon Sinclair. Against a backdrop of increased demand for a wide range of minerals as part of the energy transition, our work looks at the economic development perils and possibilities of a potential boom in critical mineral mining and refining for Australia, with a particular focus on lithium and rare earths. Is the screen sharing working okay? Okay, so GPN analyses often feature diagrams that try to link production stages and firms and other actors together and to unpick the constituent commodity and financial relationships. Here is a stylized critical mineral GPN linking from the mining firm through processors, refiners, and component manufacturers to the original equipment manufacturers who make the ultimate product, for example, an electric vehicle or wind turbine. Now, two key aspects are emerging here from our research. The first is the highly active role of state agencies and the importance of government finance in attempts to accelerate critical mineral development in Australia. In our work, we've couched this in terms of multi-scalar state de-risking strategies in the context of highly expensive, slow-moving and risky mining projects. The second is the importance of upstream relationships from component producers and OEMs stretching all the way back to the mine. And if you can see it, I'll direct you towards the red box on the figure. This can take the form of ownership, equity investment, joint ventures, but most importantly, perhaps, offtake agreements, a commitment between the producing and receiving firm to purchase a certain quantity of product over the contract's lifetime. Indeed, the analysis of offtakes has proven very important in our research. They reveal emergent long-term connections between producers and customers and help identify the lead firms structuring the production network. They're also pivotal to the triggering of public finance. Offtake levels are often written into the conditions of preferential government loans. So this kind of analysis allows us to construct quite detailed diagrams of the material and financial flows that connect, for instance, rare earth mines to downstream customers and industries. Just going to switch slides. This one, for instance, focuses on Lynas, Australia's only currently functioning rare earth mine. Now, there's lots we could unpack here in this diagram, but essentially, it shows the importance of extraterritorial support from allied governments to Lynas's operations, from Japan and more recently the US. In wrapping up, I'd like to highlight one strength and three challenges for GPN work in this space. The strength is that in the context of often rather broad brush accounts, GPN-inspired work can provide nuanced mapping of GPN reconfigurations at the industry, commodity and network levels across different geographies, and importantly, foreground the agency and strategies of lead firms and other key network participants, which all make a difference to how those reconfigurations play out. In terms of the three challenges in the context of sustainability transitions, here we are often studying attempts to construct new networks from scratch rather than analysing already existing networks, as is the norm in the literature. Our work attempts to initiate friend-shored critical mineral networks that avoid China, leading to what we call extreme de-risking, in which governments put in huge amounts of support. Second, we need to develop what I call lengthened GPN approaches that bring into view the full extent of the GPN, from raw material extraction through to waste processing and recycling, and to take its inherent materiality seriously, analytically. This necessitates extending what we think of as constituting the GPN in both upstream and downstream directions. Not many studies track back to raw materials, but this has now become of fundamental importance in the context of critical minerals, for example. And finally, I think there's more work to do to understand GPN state strategy intersections in the context of geopolitical fragmentation. There's been some great recent work trying to bring geopolitical dimensions into GPN analyses, but there remains a more general challenge of how to conceptualize the increasingly assertive role of the state, often acting extraterritorially, especially in strategic industries. So thank you, and I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you very much, Neil, for this input. I would like to ask Leah now to present your input.
Yeah, hi everyone. I don't have slides and my input is quite different. I told Jonathan in the preparations that I will say something about the global regime concept that Christian and I developed quite a long time ago now. So a lot of what I thought is important about that concept, I actually don't think is any longer important really, because the discussion has moved quite far from back in the day. But nevertheless, I will say a few things about that. So one is kind of how that whole thing came about. And I think that concept can really be seen as an outcome of both Christian and my PhD thesis. So we were doing our PhDs together many years ago, and eventually he was doing a lot of geography stuff and transitions and research in China, and I was doing institutional stuff and transitions and research in Australia, and both were working on the water sector. And despite Australia and China not having too many overlaps in material preconditions or institutional cultural aspects, we found that things developed very similarly. The discussion, the discourses around innovation in the water sector, around where to go, around sustainable solutions, etc., was very similar. So eventually, we kind of put that together and basically asked the question, why do socio-technical transitions follow similar trajectories all over the world despite very different material and institutional preconditions? And that question, as I have been told, is, I mean, it's something that warrants a geographical explanation, but it's also something that warrants a more institutional sociological explanation. And so back in the day, I think it was also the leapfrogging ideas were quite prominent. And if I remember correctly, in Christian's thesis, that played a role, like that question of, can we just, if we already know all the mistakes we've made in certain places, can we go to a different system in places that don't have the materiality of it, that haven't yet built, in our case, in the water sector, the centralized water system? And as it turned out, even though that sounds very doable and very plausible and like a good idea, it didn't seem to go that way. And so the question is, why not? And the answer, I think, has then been one to say that, well, that is about the dominant rules of the game. And so that kind of drove me during my PhD to really develop a more institutional understanding of a regime. And institutional meaning that it's about the rules of the game. And rules are institutional in nature. That doesn't mean that the materiality doesn't play a role. It just means that we have elements in the socio-technical system, material, technological, we have actors and we have institutions that co-evolve together into something broader. So these dominant rules of the games, they're kind of an emergent property of the co-evolution of all these elements, including the material things. And only because this is institutional is it possible to travel all around the world. Only because it's institutional in nature, it's possible to have an impact where you don't have the same materiality. So that was really the idea of it. We borrowed concept from sociology, especially from the Stanford School by John Mayer, that looks at world polity, that looks at how do dominant rationales all over the globe develop and diffuse. And that brought in also the question of which actors are most active in constructing these dominant rationales. And there, the overlap of a lot of the GPN and a lot of the other geography literature was becoming more obvious, to basically say that there are very particular types of actors that are contributing and or have the definitional authority to construct, diffuse, change the dominant rationales. And that's, for instance, a lot of consultants, a lot of knowledge-intensive businesses, a lot of engineering companies, state actors, and so forth. And so since then, that was kind of the original idea. I think we've developed both in the institutional parts of the story as well as the actor part of the story. And I think the latest paper we finally published after years of going around kind of shows how we think of this kind of more nuanced perspective of what institutions are, how institutionalized something is, and how coherent, how many rationalities there are, but also elaborates much more on the spatial characteristics that impact these institutional dynamics. And so I want to stop by saying that I think this is really that overlap of how the geography impacts the institutional rationalities and how the institutional rationalities or cultural cognitive rationalities impact the geography. I think in that interface really lies a lot of explanatory value for understanding how transitions unfold. All right, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Leah, for your input. Now I would give the word to Roberta for your input.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be here, and I also would like to congratulate you because I mean there is an amazing number of participants to this webinar. So My starting point is a recent article published in Environmental Innovation and Societal Transitions by Ant and colleagues, in which is clearly underlined that the GVC approach can be useful to understanding the green industrial transformation. And the green industrial transformation is exactly what I've been studying together with Rasmus Lema in a number of research output, and actually we are trying to finalize a book for Cambridge University Press, trying to put all this research together. So I think we can say that transition studies focus on how sustainability transitions disrupt incumbent socio-technical regimes. And in our work, we claim that these disruptions, which namely are new technologies, shift in demand and policy pressure, can open green windows of opportunity, which facilitate the entry or the repositioning in global industries for latecomer countries. But we also say that entry, of course, is not automatic. Whether countries, regions, or firms can seize these windows depend crucially on how green GVCs are organized and governed globally. And they also depend on country and sector preconditions, and on public and private actor responses to these emerging opportunities. And this is where the GVC approach becomes crucial, because the transition studies tend to focus on innovation, experimentation, and diffusion, but often underplay a fundamental challenge, which is scaling production and industrial development. Innovation does not automatically translate into jobs, income, or upgrading. And the GVC analysis helps to address questions such as where in the value chain can latecomers realistically enter, under what condition can they upgrade, when are they likely to remain locked into low value segment. So scaling green technologies requires manufacturing capacity, deployment capabilities, supplier network skills, finance, and access to critical input, all of which are shaped by GVC governance. And I will just very briefly present you some results for a paper we publish in Journal of International Business Policy, in which we focus on 12 middle-income countries and 3 renewable energy industries to investigate under what combination of structural precondition and industrial policies do green windows of opportunity translate into GVC participation and into GVC upgrading. And in this paper, we distinguish between a manufacturing chain and the deployment chain. And we believe that this distinction is very relevant, in particularly in less developed countries and regions, because deployment and services offer more accessible entry point and greater job creation potential, and often higher value capture than manufacturing alone, particularly in less developed countries. So just to, in one sentence, the result of this study is that participation in renewable energy global value chains is relatively widespread and can be achieved through multiple policy pathways, even in the presence of weak structural preconditions. While upgrading is far more selective, it requires not only industrial policy, but a specific alignment between technology, intervention, and accumulated sector capabilities. So in our world, while many middle-income countries manage to enter green global value chains, only a subset effectively seize the windows of opportunity in a transformative sense. Then, of course, there is the issue of governance, but I don't have the time enter into details, but of course, governance is impacting on how precondition and policy configuration act in terms of upgrading change. And to conclude, I think transition studies explain why and when windows of opportunity open, and GVC analysis help to explain who can enter, where value is captured, and how power and learning are distributed. An integrated approach between transition studies and GVC can help to explain whether the green transitions can become engines of late camera development or new sources of dependencies, depending on policy choices. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Roberta, for your input. Now I would give the word to Christian.
Thanks a lot, and welcome again from my side. So actually, my strategy was to focus on one particular aspect in my input, which now pays off hearing the other perspective. So I can add another complementary sort of perspective maybe on the issue, which is about the interface of global production network, GVC sort of approaches, and global innovation system frameworks. So the question, how does transformative innovation, in these green sort of fields come about, and then how could a maybe integrated conceptual approach sort of help to work through these sort of questions? And I also start from the same observation, like my colleagues, that in a way, I think transition studies is still quite oblivious in many ways to the more international and multi-scalar sort of relationships that influence how and where transitions come about. And then it's quite natural and maybe overdue that we sort of try to integrate more with the GPN GVC perspectives to get a better hold of these sort of multi-scalar interdependencies. At the same time, also from my own experience, I know that it's actually harder to get a good conceptual integration than what is often assumed. And with GIS, it's particularly interesting because in this literature, we use conceptual language that's quite close to GPN or GVC literature. So we talk about global networks, and we use the notion of structural coupling, which sounds quite similar to strategic coupling. But in essence, it's quite different. The mechanisms we mean are still quite different. And so I would like to make maybe a bit also an input that sort of puts up a bit of caution that if we want to integrate, go for modular conceptual integration, as it's put in the paper by Hunt et al., then what's maybe the pitfalls to consider? I can just share one slide, which is from a paper we're currently developing with David Wolf and Bernhard Truffer, where we look into the commonalities and differences between GPN, GVC, and the GIS literatures specifically. And so there we see that already the conceptual roots, differ between these approaches, but then also the key structural elements you're interested in, they differ. So in the GPN GVC world, you're interested in lead firms, their supplier, intermediary networks, value chain sort of configurations, and then also the institutional architectures that stabilize this. Whereas in the GIS world, you're much more into entrepreneurial networks that are trying to develop a new configuration from scratch, a new sort of clean tech industry that's then sort of able to develop and diffuse across space. And also the interplay between global dynamics and sort of regional dynamics is quite different. So in a way, in the GPN GVC world, the value chains, the lead firms, they're out there, and the region can then sort of try to couple or decouple or recouple with these sort of pre-existing structures, whereas in the GIS world, you try to develop them for the first time, and then you try to patch together the system resources that help to create this new industrial path and sort of move it forward. So in a way, I think it's sort of complementary. So both perspectives, they offer complementary insights into the organization of production and innovation at an international level, and how it then also matters for places. And there's some key differences. I think the GPN GVC world is more about mature sector, more incremental reconfigurations in existing well-established value chains, focus on lead firms and complex, long value chains. Whereas in the GIS world, you're much more with these emerging sectors, radical innovation, and then more spread out social technical systems that sort of create a new industrial path. So the differences are not purely semantic. And so, strategic versus structural coupling are really different mechanisms. And so then you also need a bit of a hold. What's then their strengths and weaknesses? So I think from a GIS perspective, what you can do really well, for example, this is just one example I often bring up, is to explain why China could catch up so quickly with the rest of the world in the solar PV field. And then with this GIS lens, you can say the local entrepreneurs, they were actually able to anchor, system resources that were available elsewhere, like, knowledge, market access to mass markets in Germany and Japan, investment from US banks and so on, to develop a path, locally in this emerging field in China. but it doesn't help to explain other key aspects of the same story. So, for example, the outsourcing of PV panel manufacturing now to Vietnam and Malaysia that has happened in the past years, that's much better explained through a GPN GVC lens, where you can say actually this move, on the one hand side was sort of, Chinese lead firms trying to improve their cost capability ratio and avoiding US tariffs. And seen from Vietnamese and sort of Malaysian regions, it was of course an attempt to sort of strategically couple to a sort of emerging GPN to also climb the capability ladder. So then, how do we want to sort of create joint sort of theorizing? So in this paper by Huntedal, they propose modular conceptual integration. I would maybe argue more for sort of engaged pluralism, that we try to find sort of key empirical exemplars, maybe like the one that also Neil brought up, and then use that to showcase the benefits of an integrated perspective and sort of develop sort of combined conceptual approaches around these boundary objects. And there's a few places where I think, this could be done quite nicely. One is really this aspect of GPN, GVC construction in emerging clean tech sectors. So in a lot of fields that we're interested in transitions, we're now at a phase where the GIS phase is sort of over and you're getting closer to having a sort of a proto GPN or GVC that's emerging. And so how does this come about? What's the processes that then define who takes the leadership role, how the governance of that GPN or GVC structure is sort of building out, who wins, who loses in that? I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to be done that's sort of low-hanging fruit. And maybe on the other side of the same coin, and also for regional sort of reconfiguration. So if you think about regions that want to move into a new green industrial path, one aspect is the leapfrogging that also Lea mentioned, but the other is then also can you use strategic coupling to these emerging GPNs as a way to get a foothold in these sort of future sort of, also sort of growth industries. And the last very short point, I think also methodologically, in both GPN and GIS literatures, also transition studies, networks have also always been a bit implicit. And so there are sort of advances, especially in the transitions field now with semantic network analysis, that I think could be quite a powerful tool to make the networks more explicit, sort of analyze them in a more structured way in both literatures. So that's maybe the last point I want to make. And that's all from my side, so thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot for all your inputs, Neil, Lea, Roberta, and Christian. This was already very insightful. To the audience, we will now have a moderated discussion, but if you have questions already now, please put them in the chat, and please use thumb up to kind of like vote up questions, which I can then ask to the panelists. To the panelists, is there anything from your side? Would you like to ask a question right now to any of the other presenters? Otherwise, I would be interested, particularly in your perspective on this, Neil. I mean, you also wrote this paper in Progress in Economic Geography, where you argue for that there has to be more engagement within the global production networks community on the issue of decarbonization and sustainability related transformations more generally. I was wondering, like, how do you explain that there has not been so much research being done at this interface, particularly also from a GPN perspective, and this has only recently gained some sort of interest?
Wow, nice easy question for 9:30 in the evening. I think, well, a silly answer would be it's complicated, right? These are very, very complicated networks. So as we try to raise in that piece that you mentioned, Jonathan, that there are definitional issues here about where networks start, end, are they networks of networks, and so on. And also then to work out the kind of material and carbon footprints of those networks. I think it's not just about value, which is what economic geographers are good at studying. It's about understanding material transformations and materiality and so on, which is less a key strength of the GPN approach. So that's really the direction that this mining work is nudging me in. Is that first of all, we have to understand the materiality and the material transformations, which can be very complicated, involving 7 to 10 steps for certain critical minerals. And we then have to think about how that underpins the structure of the network. Just one other point. I mean, I think what is a green GPN, what isn't? I mean, I think that's complicated, right? We tend to focus on the green industries, such as electric vehicles, solar panels, and so on. But lots of other ways that we could think about the greening of the economy in terms of cleaner production methods, reducing the externalities of current production, increasing the production of old but environmentally friendly technologies, such as bikes and plastic replacements. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of analytical work and some methodological challenges to exactly pin down the carbon and materiality challenges within GPN. So I hope that starts to answer the question, but more to be done for sure. I agree.
Leah and Christian, maybe a question for you, coming from the transitions field. How does such a network perspective, how could this advance, like, you know, the work on global regimes, for example, that you have been doing? Like, how can maybe this produce some more sophisticated insights into, let's say, actors and their kind of like roles?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, my experience has been that there's a bit of a disconnect of the sort of empirical work that we do in transition studies and the GPN GVC literature. So I think a lot on the GPN GVC side is looking into, you know, manufacturing sectors, some exemplars like semiconductors and automotive and so on. And in transition studies, we're more interested in the sort of infrastructure sectors of the foundational economy. So, you know, energy, water, whatever, mobility, and so on. And so I've always looked for GPN GVC studies that could actually be useful to my work, you know, in these sectors, but there isn't too much in a way. And also the other way around. So I think that was something where we actually tried to then, when we thought about also the global regime concept with Leah, we thought, okay, so what's the GPN structure in the water field? And there weren't any studies on that really. So we basically then needed a sort of a network approach to get a first hold, you know, of the sort of actor networks that really control this sort of the water sector, and to also find maybe the hidden power structures in the GPN that you only get when you sort of combine, you know, different types of network information from. We basically looked into the ownership structures of the large MNCs in the water field and where the subsidiaries are. That we try to locate where the biggest engineering consultants in that field are located, and then try to work through sort of project documents from where big water infrastructure are being built to find out who was involved in building them up. And by triangulating across different sort of network databases, in the end, we got a hold of what does actually the GPN structure look like in that field. And then, of course, you can go from there and then get into much more qualitative detail on how that then has an impact on what happens or doesn't happen, where transitions become possible, where these global regime solutions are most easily diffused, and where this is maybe harder. So I think there's a lot to be gained from these methods in that respect, for sure.
Yeah, I can maybe add one reflection to that question, and that's the difference between networks and actor perspectives. And I think this is where a lot of the issues lie when we want to merge frameworks that have a completely different ontological basis. So in the global regimes, I don't know actually if Christian fully subscribes to this, but of course my kind of more sociological institutional perspective was that it's interesting to look at which types of actors construct and have the definitional authority to uphold, to change, to get rid of dominant rules of the game. That is a very different question than whether or not the network structure of the actors matter. So this is in sociology, it's very clear. Institutional approaches and network approaches are both highly structural approaches to explaining reality very differently. And I think in the network approach, the most obvious thing is to say that it doesn't necessarily matter who you are, but where you are. And that the structure itself, so how the actors are related to each other, that's the explanatory value, that's the causal relationship. And I think this is very different from saying, oh yeah, let's look at which actors are important in this system or in this regime. And I think there has been a lot of quite blurry research that calls something network without actually meaning network in a sociological sense. So it doesn't matter where an actor is located, it just matters that actors are somehow connected to each other and they do something, etc. But that's not like what you would then, what I would consider to be a network-based structural argument. So in that sense, I think more clarity there would give us much more leeway actually to start developing more overlaps and be really clear about what do we think is the causality here. Is it the network structure that then enables transitions, or is it just, power and actor dominance and these types of questions? All really interesting. I'm just saying that this is these are two very different questions, and they relate to the institutional rules of the game very different. So I think it's important to clarify that before being able to actually talk about transitions. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for this, Lea and Christian. Roberta, I was wondering about the green windows of opportunity, and if you think about the global regime and what would be some sort of intersection between these concepts in terms of, for example, how it would allow you to potentially identify green windows of opportunity. Would this be of any help? Could there be some sort of intersection happening here?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think this is fundamental, and this is something that is really changing the. I mean, has been changing the way in which we have been dealing with this concept since we started, because of course also the rules of the global regimes have changed quite a lot, and the geography of the global geography of green industries have also changed and are still changing. And in this sense, I think that it will something that in terms of green windows of opportunity for latecomers, which will be very relevant, will be the role that it will be taken by China, in the sense that China could take a leading position in terms of I mean, it already has a leading position in terms of green technologies, but could take a leading position also in terms of diffusing these green technologies to latecomers countries. And this will for sure influence how the role that these countries could take in these industries. And I think what was just said in terms of relationship within the networks is very important from the point of view of global value chains, and probably this is something that it will be very important to take into account and to integrate in the global value chain analysis, which tend to be very much focused on actors and on the relationship within networks, and less on the perspective that Lea was presenting in terms of networks, which I think will be a very useful complement in global value chain analysis, and in particular in understanding how the GVC approach can be useful in terms of understanding the opportunities for latecomer countries in these industries.
Thanks a lot for this. So now that we are coming closer to the last 50 minutes of our webinar, I would like to open up and also take questions from the audience. So one is about the question of how the global north relies on mineral and other resources from other global south countries, which are often still developing. and how actually we can zoom in, how to tackle value chains and just transitions. Christian, you touched a bit on that in your presentation, and the question is, how can we best theorize these linkages between the global north and south, and the question of minerals and other resources that the global north relies on in transition processes? This is a question to all the four of you, so if someone wants to say something, you can raise your hands.
Just very quickly, I think also Roberta touched upon this. I think we're in a phase now where a lot of GPNs in these new also sectors are emerging and being configured for the first time. And so then the question is, in this configuration phase, do we manage to get them sort of configured in a way that who wins and loses is maybe distributed a bit differently than how it worked in the past? And that's for me the key question. I guess Roberta has more to say about this than I do, but I think this is a critical point in a way. If it doesn't work now, then we're back in the old waters again, also with these new sectors.
Neil, do you have maybe anything to add from also having focused on critical minerals at least?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I know Australia is not global south, but here there's a very live debate. I mean, obviously, mining's been a key industry in Australia for a long, long time, and there's a real concern here that this new critical mineral boom is just going to be more of the same in terms of extractive and exploitative mining. And it's notable in many of the government strategies at the state and federal level here that the kind of environmental, indigenous, labour factors do not really show up in the policies and strategies as written. So civil society, environmental groups are very active in trying to say that there's an opportunity here not just to mine more stuff and sell it into the global market, but to do it in a better and less impactful way. But the analysis that Leon and I did of the first raft of strategies was showing precisely the opposite, that those kind of concerns were not foregrounded. It was all about the economic development rationale, and that's in Australia, that has money and a relatively good reputation in terms of mining. So, yeah.
Yeah. If I can add something, I think, I mean, also it's quite interesting how China has used the global dependence on rare earth as a geopolitical tool very recently, which is really entering a new perspective into the story, I would say.
Thanks a lot. Then we have a question from Frank Eels about now that we are entering the phase of mass diffusion and thus mass production, should we not pay more attention to big contemporary topics like first, relations between production, trade, conflict, and great power rivalry? Second, the shift from a neoliberal era where policy helps or supports GVCs to geoeconomics where policymakers use GVCs for political goals. And third, changes in the rule-based order, particularly trade rules that underpin GVCs, which the hegemon, the US, is now blowing up as they are losing the global trade war. Yeah, yes.
I mean, I'm not quite sure if I understand the question fully, but I think whenever you do an analysis these days of any empirical situation, you will encounter these dynamics. So I think so the question, should we focus more on that, to me is somewhat strange, because I don't think we can afford not to, or I don't think any of us will ever get more like empirical data where this wasn't a very clear dynamic. So even if you go in with I don't know, you want to do some TIS analysis or whatever have you, well, you're gonna encounter in an infrastructure sector these days questions of trade and tariffs. You always have. It's just that, you know, they were quite taken for granted and the logics were aligned, and so now they're just quite disruptive with our sustainability focus. And yeah, maybe shout out to Jonathan's perspective paper that was recently published, or will be published soonish in ICE, or has been, I don't know, Jonathan. But there is exactly that trade-off between sustainability and like geo-economic sovereignty questions. And to me, it's not a question of what do we researchers focus on. It's more a question of what do we find when we look. And that's not up to us. And if our frameworks would exclude certain dynamics that are important to understand change, then our frameworks are really problematic, I would say. So yeah, so I don't think it's a research question necessarily. It's more of a if we it's the world gives us what we need to focus on, most likely.
Yeah, I agree with Leah. I think we can't avoid this. I guess one thing I would add from the GPM perspective is I think we need to study how these things are playing out differently at industry, commodity, and individual network levels. Because once you drill down to individual networks, individual firms, they're responding to this shifting wider context in quite different ways. So we looked at all the lithium firms in Australia and how they were responding to pressure to kind of disconnect from China and reconnect to allied countries, and they were going in very different directions, in path-dependent ways, depending on the kind of relationships they'd already built up. So what's for me is interesting is how these processes create variegated reconfigurations at the network level.
Maybe to also add just quickly, I think there's actually a lot of literature is already going down that route, you know, in GPN, also in economic geography more broadly, and transition studies too. And I feel like what's interesting also finding from GPN GVC is that in many cases, it's actually much harder to reshore these value chains or to sort of deeply reconfigure them than what you would think. So I always remember Henry Young when he told that basically in the semiconductors industry, it's going to take 30 years at least to really reshore this sort of also chip manufacturing back in the US. So it's not something that can happen from one day to the other. So I think there's an interesting tension building up here where there is, of course, a lot of now sort of push to sort of reshore or maybe to sort of rearrange these global value chains configurations into maybe more geopolitical blocks. But then this is not going to be easy, or how to exactly this will play out. I think that's quite an interesting question to now trace.
Yeah, if I can also add something, I mean, I think that the GVC perspective from this point of view is very, what has happened from the GVC perspective is very instructive in the sense that, I mean, if you think about how many things have changed in terms of trade and how quickly they are changing. I mean, in these days, every day something Trump is coming out with a different Trump tariff. And of course, what GVC have shown is that, of course, there have been changes, fundamental changes, for instance, in terms of geographical reconfiguration. But the main way of organizing production internationally is there. So what it makes difficult from the point of view of research is the uncertainty, which is particularly high in this moment, and which is for sure impacting on the structural configuration of global value chains.
Great. Then I would like to maybe as a somewhat last question, because we are coming closer to 12, I would like to think about, I mean, Leah, you mentioned that there's quite some ontological things to consider when bridging concepts and trying to cross-fertilize between the different communities, right? From a more relational approach to institution and co-evolutionary ideas. So I was thinking about, and Christian, also you mentioned this, that we would have to find right empirical examples, and that particularly also GPN research has focused on different empirical cases than maybe the transitions research has. So what could be interesting cases to look at, so that maybe some people here feel inspired to do research about these from basically different perspectives?
I mean, I don't know any like particular cases, but I like the way that I think about choosing empirical analysis is, well, it depends. Like you need to have either theoretical interest or an empirical curiosity that is somewhat intriguing to you and figuring out why that is. And very often both of these are just rooted in our own frameworks and where we're most comfortable. But instead of I mean, I think I want to echo what I think Christian said in his input, more towards pluralism than merging, because I think you can get really inspired by a lot of frameworks and by a lot of like mechanisms that are put forward, and the evidence can be really like mounting for one argument over the other, but that doesn't necessarily make the other argument not also valid in many cases at different times and so forth. So I would advocate to be theoretically sharp and keep that outside of the empirics, and then see where empirics actually speaks to that. That doesn't have to always be, we're not scientists like natural scientists, I hope. So we do have the flexibility to put forward theories as tools of understanding rather than being right. And if we're looking for the truth, I think we're always going to fight about whose framework to pick and completely ignore the plethora of insights we can have when acknowledging that sometimes it's institutions, sometimes it's networks, sometimes it's actors, sometimes it's technology, sometimes it's the market. Like all of these arguments, let's say we developed about 10 over the years, 10 fundamental mechanisms. They're all relevant. We've all seen all the studies. It's just they're not always relevant in the same to the same extent. And I think currently we're experiencing social change, and that comes along with that other mechanisms will be more important than maybe the ones we had 10, 20 years ago. And I think that's really exciting because it's going to have more empirical evidence for something that currently was not able. Like 10 years ago, we wouldn't have been able to study that because it didn't happen. Now it happens, so we can study it. It doesn't make the studies before invalid. So I would rather plea for that kind of pluralistic approach rather than finding, the one true way.
Does someone want to add something? Otherwise, I think we are coming close to 12, and Roberta has to leave sharp. So I thank you all for your inputs and discussion. This was really insightful. And we will have follow-up webinars within this series that tackle more specific questions about value chains, power and governance, as well as then also as a last one, the geopolitical aspects, and also a topic that we touched upon today, developmental outcomes and just transitions. So we would be happy to have you join these webinars as well. Thanks a lot for joining today, and we see each other in 2 weeks.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you for organizing. Bye.